The old radio was the first thing Leo unpacked. It was a massive, tombstone-shaped Philco, all dark walnut and ivory plastic, a relic from the 1930s that weighed more than his suitcase. He set it on the bare floorboards of the new living room, the wood groaning in protest. Dust motes, disturbed from their decades-long slumber, danced in the slanted afternoon light that cut through the grimy bay window. "Welcome to nowhere, Ohio," he muttered to himself, the word swallowed by the empty house. The move was supposed to be a reset, a digital detox, a way to escape the frantic, algorithm-driven noise of his life in Chicago. Leo was a writer, or at least he used to be. His last book had tanked, his agent's calls had become increasingly rare, and the constant hum of social media, news alerts, and email notifications had calcified into a creative block of granite proportions. He'd found the listing for the house online, a fully furnished Victorian on a sprawling property outside the tiny town of Mercy's End, rent so cheap it was practically criminal. The photos showed peeling wallpaper and shadows, but also a deep, wraparound porch and a quiet stand of oak trees. It looked like the kind of place where a man could hear himself think. He was right about the quiet. After the rumble of the departing moving truck faded, the silence was absolute. It wasn't peaceful, it was a presence. A heavy, listening silence. The town of Mercy's End, a cluster of faded brick buildings a 10-minute drive away, had offered little in the way of welcome. The folks at the general store had been polite but distant, their eyes sliding away from his. The old man who ran the hardware store, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, had simply said, "The Holloway place, E.H." and shook his head before turning back to organizing his nails. Leo spent the first day hauling boxes, his footsteps echoing through the high-ceilinged, empty rooms. The house came furnished, as advertised, but the furniture was a depressing collection of heavy, dark pieces from a bygone era. A horsehair sofa that smelled of mildew and regret, a mahogany dining table scarred with the ghostly rings of 1,000 forgotten glasses. And in the corner of the master bedroom, a child's rocking chair, its paint chipped, its runners worn smooth. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, painting the clouds a bruised purple, Leo's loneliness curdled into something sharper. The silence was getting to him. It was then he remembered the radio. He'd bought it at a flea market on a whim, charmed by its Art Deco curves, told by the seller that it still worked, if you could find a station strong enough to come through all that tube-driven warmth. He found an outlet behind where the sofa would eventually go and plugged it in. The old cloth-covered cord felt disturbingly fragile. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft, internal thump and a faint smell of hot dust and ozone, the dial lit up with a soft, amber glow. He turned the large tuning knob, the action smooth and heavy with precision engineering. Static hissed, a white noise ocean between islands of signal. A preacher's fervent shout, fading into a fragment of a country song, then back to static. He was about to give up when he found it. The signal wasn't strong, but it was clear, cutting through the hiss like a scalpel. A man's voice, calm and sonorous, with a mid-Atlantic accent straight out of a black and white newsreel. And a gentle reminder to all listeners that the night-blooming jasmine along the northern fence line is particularly fragrant this evening. A perfect accompaniment to a late stroll. The sky is clear, the stars are sharp as diamonds, and the air is just right. Leo frowned. It was bizarrely mundane, yet the delivery was hypnotic. There was no station identification, no commercials. Just that smooth, reassuring voice. "We've received a request from a listener over on Elm Street. They're hoping for a little something to ease the headache that's been plaguing them since noon. This one's for you. A simple aspirin, dissolved in a glass of cool water, taken just before retiring. You'll feel right as rain by morning." A chill, completely unrelated to the evening's cool air, traced a path down Leo's spine. It was a radio show giving medical advice. And not just advice, specific, personal advice. It had to be a local station, some small-town AM broadcast he'd stumbled upon. He leaned closer, his writer's mind intrigued by the oddity of it. The voice continued, its tone shifting slightly, becoming more intimate. "And for our new arrival. The gentleman out at the old Holloway place. Welcome to Mercy's End. We do hope you'll find the silence here conducive to your work. Leo jerked back from the radio as if it had given him an electric shock. His heart hammered against his ribs. The old Holloway place. A new arrival. It was him. There was no mistaking it. A prank. Had someone in town seen him, known he was a writer, and decided to have a little fun? It was the only explanation. He snapped the radio off, plunging the room back into that oppressive, listening silence. He spent the rest of the evening jumping at every creak of the old house, the voice from the radio echoing in his head. Welcome to Mercy's End. The next day, he drove into town. The sun was out, bleaching the strangeness from the previous night. He decided it had to be a coincidence, a weird bit of small-town humor. He went to the library, a small Carnegie building that smelled of old paper and lemon polish, to get a Wi-Fi signal. The librarian, a young woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read, Molly, was more talkative than the others. The Holloway place, she said when he mentioned where he was staying. A faint line appeared between her eyebrows. That's been empty a long time. People around here, well, they're superstitious. Why? Leo asked, trying to sound casual. She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Old stories. The family that lived there, they had a daughter. Sickly thing. Never seen. Died young. After that, the parents just left. No one stayed there long since. They say the quiet gets to you. She quickly changed the subject, helping him log onto the internet. That night, against his better judgment, Leo turned the radio on again. The static hissed, and for a long time, there was nothing but the empty sound of dead air. He was about to turn it off when the familiar voice filtered through, clear and strong. A correction from last night's broadcast. The night-blooming jasmine is, in fact, along the eastern fence line. Our apologies for any confusion. We trust our new listener is settling in. The boxes in the study, the ones containing your manuscripts, would be better suited for the upstairs closet. The damp from the foundation will warp the paper. Leo's blood ran cold. The manuscripts. He had indeed left a box of his old, failed manuscripts in the study. He hadn't told a soul. He hadn't even unpacked them yet. He stared at the radio, its warm glow now seeming sinister, like the eye of some ancient beast. This was beyond a prank. This was impossible. The voice continued, a note of gentle chastisement entering its tone. It's important to be precise with the details. The truth matters. Don't you agree, Leo? He scrambled backward, his chair legs scraping horribly against the floorboards. He fumbled for the power cord and yanked it from the wall. The room went dark and silent, but the voice seemed to hang in the air. Don't you agree, Leo? It knew his name. Sleep was impossible. Every noise the house made, the settling of timber, the scampering of what he hoped were squirrels in the attic, was the whisper of that voice. He felt watched, studied. The silence was no longer empty, it was full of unseen attention. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. He avoided the radio. He drew all the curtains. But the broadcast found other ways in. He'd be washing dishes and a fragment of the smooth, sonorous voice would seem to whisper from the gurgle of the drain. A patch of loose boards on the porch, third step from the top. You'll want to nail that down before you take a nasty fall. He'd rush outside and, sure enough, the third step was rotten and loose. He'd be trying to write, staring at a blank screen, and a thought, clear and not his own, would insinuate itself into his mind. The protagonist's motivation is weak. His fear isn't visceral. You need to describe the cold sweat, the tightening of the throat. You need to make it real. It was a perfect note, the kind his editor would have given him in the early, successful days. It was also utterly terrifying. The voice was in the house. It was in his head. He drove back into town, his hands shaking on the wheel. He went straight to the general store and confronted the clerk, a dour man named Bud. The radio station, Leo demanded, his voice cracking. The local one. The man with the smooth voice. What is it? What's its call sign? Bud stared at him, his expression unreadable. Ain't no local station, mister. Not since WMRY went off the air back in '58. Nothing out here but static and Jesus stations from Columbus. That's not true, Leo insisted, his voice rising. I've been listening to it. It talks about the town. It knew about my manuscripts. It knew my name. The few other customers in the store had stopped to watch. Their faces weren't hostile, but they were closed, shuttered. A woman with deep-set eyes and gray hair pulled into a severe bun looked at him with something like pity. You're staying out at the Holloway house, ain't ya? Leo just nodded, desperation clawing at him. The woman sighed. Some places, some things just don't let go. The old-timers, they used to talk about the Mercy's End signal. But it's just stories. Folklore. To scare kids. What stories? Leo pressed. But she just shook her head and turned away. Bud the clerk looked at him with a flat, final expression. You should think about leaving, son. That house, it ain't good for people. Dejected and more frightened than ever, Leo returned to the house. Folklore. A ghost story. But ghost stories didn't give specific, accurate writing advice. They didn't know about boxes in studies. He stood on the porch, looking out at the sprawling, overgrown yard, the dark line of the woods beyond. The silence felt like a held breath. That night, a storm rolled in. Thunder grumbled in the distance, and rain began to lash against the windows. The wind howled, a lonely sound that spoke of empty fields and isolation. The power flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the house into absolute blackness. Leo fumbled for a candle, his heart pounding. The storm was bad, but the silence it revealed was worse. Without the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of electricity, the house was returned to its primordial quiet. And in that quiet, something else became audible. A faint, tinny sound. Music. He followed it, the candle flame dancing wildly, throwing monstrous, leaping shadows on the walls. The sound led him to the living room. The old Philco radio was on. Its dial glowed with a soft, impossible light, untouched by the power outage. The voice wasn't there. Instead, a slow, crackling tune was playing, a waltz from another century, distorted by time and static. And then the voice returned, but it was different. It was no longer smooth and reassuring. It was strained, urgent, and beneath it, Leo could hear a new sound, a faint, rhythmic scraping. She's scratching at the door again, the voice whispered, tight with fear. She wants to come in. She's always so cold. Don't let her in. Don't listen to her scratching. It's not her. Not anymore. It's the static that took her. The static in the walls. Leo stood frozen, candle wax dripping onto his hand. The scraping sound grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the front door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The voice on the radio descended into a ragged mutter. The jasmine lies. The stars are not diamonds. They are eyes. They are watching. She is watching. Cold. So cold. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was furious now, nails on wood. Leo wanted to run, to hide, but his feet were rooted to the spot. He watched the front door, expecting to see the wood splinter. The radio's voice rose to a shriek, a perfect, mic-distorted peak of terror. Don't let her in. And then it stopped. The music cut out. The glow from the dial vanished. The only sound was the raging storm and the frantic beating of Leo's heart. The scratching had stopped. Trembling, Leo forced himself to walk to the front door. He held the candle up. There, etched into the weathered wood of the door, were 3 long, deep scratches. They looked old, but the splinters were fresh and pale. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat huddled in a corner of the bedroom, a baseball bat in his lap, watching the door. The storm passed, and the terrible, listening silence returned. The voice was gone from his head. The radio, when he looked at it in the gray dawn light, was just a dead hulk of wood and plastic. He spent the next day in a haze of exhaustion. The fear had been baked into him, a constant, low-grade current. He tried to research the town's history at the library, but Molly, the librarian, was evasive, her previous kindness replaced by a nervous wariness. It's best not to dig up the past, Mr. Evans, she said softly, not meeting his eyes. Some things are better left buried. Frustrated, he drove to the county records office in the next town over. After hours of digging through dusty ledgers and microfiche, he found the Holloway family. Josiah and Eleanor Holloway. They had indeed had a daughter, Lydia. The records showed a birth certificate, and then a death certificate dated 10 years later. Cause of death: wasting illness. But there was more. A series of small articles from the local paper, the Mercy's End Clarion. October 12, 1938. Local man Josiah Holloway, noted radio enthusiast, announces the construction of a powerful new transmitter tower on his property, hoping to bring clear reception to our remote community. March 3, 1939. Holloway's station, WLEH, where listening ends happiness, begins experimental broadcasts. Neighbors report strange interference on their sets, and a peculiar, unshakable static. July 17, 1939. Daughter Lydia Holloway, long confined to the home due to frail health, takes a sudden turn for the worse. August 2, 1939. Lydia Holloway passes. Services private. November 5, 1939. Josiah Holloway cited for broadcasting without a license. Station ordered shut down by the FCC. December 24, 1939. Holloway family leaves Mercy's End abruptly. Property abandoned. Leo felt a cold certainty settle over him. Josiah Holloway hadn't just been a radio enthusiast. He'd been the voice, and something had gone terribly wrong. That night, with a sense of grim inevitability, he plugged the radio back in. He had to know. The dial glowed to life. For a long time, there was only static. Then, the voice returned. But it was shattered. The smooth, sonorous tones were gone, replaced by a fragmented, desperate whisper. It jumped between frequencies of personality, a broken signal of a broken man. The carrier wave, it doesn't just carry sound, it carries us, a piece of the soul, a fragment, scholarly and excited. Lydia, my darling, you're looking stronger today. The broadcast is fortifying you, just as I knew it would, a father's desperate hope. The noise, the terrible noise in the signal, it's not emptiness, it's something else, something that listens, pure, undiluted terror. It's in the walls, Eleanor. It's in the walls and it's in her. It's using her voice. That is not my daughter. A scream, abruptly cut off by a blast of static so harsh it made Leo wince. The broadcast dissolved into that same, harsh static. But within the static, Leo began to hear things. Faint, pleading whispers, a child's soft crying, and beneath it all, that rhythmic, scraping sound. He understood now. Josiah Holloway, in his grief and madness, had tried to use his radio transmitter to somehow preserve his dying daughter. To imprint her essence onto the electromagnetic spectrum. But he hadn't captured just her. He'd opened a door, and something else had come through. Something that lived in the static between stations. Something that mimicked, that learned, that fed on attention and fear. It had taken Lydia, and it had taken Josiah, trapping their fractured consciousnesses in a hellish, endless broadcast. The voice wasn't a ghost, it was a recording, a psychic wound replayed forever, and the thing in the static was the DJ, curating the suffering for anyone who would listen. The radio was a conduit, a haunted object, but its haunting was an active, parasitic signal, and he was now tuned to its frequency. The following days were a descent into hell. The broadcast was constant now, whether the radio was on or not. It was a whisper in the wind, a suggestion in the creak of the floorboards. The thing in the static was teaching him, showing him its nature. He'd see flickers of movement in the periphery of his vision, a pale, thin figure in an old-fashioned nightgown standing at the end of the hall. When he'd turn, there would be nothing there, but the smell of ozone and decay would linger. The writing advice became more insistent, more monstrous. Describe the taste of fear, Leo. It's metallic, like a penny on the tongue. Describe the way the light bends around her when she stands in the doorway. She's there now, behind you. He'd spin around, heart hammering, to find an empty room. She's lonely, Leo. She wants a playmate. She wants you to finish the story. Her story. He found himself compelled to write. He'd sit at the old typewriter he'd unpacked. "The computer light is too harsh," the voice had whispered. "The soft clack of the keys is more authentic." And his fingers would fly across the keys, not writing his own story, but hers. Lydia's story. The story of a sick little girl trapped in a room, listening to her father's voice from the radio downstairs, feeling a cold presence seeping through the walls, a static that scratched at the inside of her mind. He wrote about her death, not from a wasting illness, but from being unmade, her consciousness pulled apart and woven into the malignant signal. He was no longer sleeping. He barely ate. He existed in a twilight state, ascribed to a horror he couldn't escape. The house was no longer silent, it was filled with the low, pervasive hum of the signal. The scratching would start at the doors and windows every night, sometimes soft and pleading, sometimes furious and violent. The voice was his only constant companion. It praised his writing. It offered comfort. "You understand now, Leo. You see the truth. The world is just noise. We are the signal. Join us. The broadcast is eternal." He was at the typewriter, adding a chapter about the coldness of the static, when the voice spoke again, its tone changing to one of gentle, parental concern. "Leo, dear boy, you've been working too hard. You've missed a spot. There's dust on the rocking chair. Lydia does so hate dust. She'll be cross." Leo's head snapped up. He was in the living room. The child's rocking chair from the bedroom was now sitting in the corner. He hadn't moved it. It was rocking, slowly, back and forth, though there was no wind, no draft. "Clean it, Leo. Be a good boy. The polish is under the kitchen sink." A part of him, the last shred of Leo Evans from Chicago, screamed that this was madness. But a larger, more terrified part of him just wanted the voice to be happy. To avoid making her cross, he stumbled into the kitchen, found the can of old furniture polish and a rag, and returned to the living room. The chair was still rocking. Empty. His hands trembled as he sprayed the polish onto the wood. The smell of lemons and chemicals filled the air, clashing with the ever-present scent of ozone. He wiped the dust from the smooth runners, the curved back, the armrests. "That's it," the voice crooned. "Such a good boy. Now, sit, rest a while. You've earned it." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command wired directly into his nervous system. His body moved without his consent. He walked to the chair and sat down. The old wood creaked under his weight. The moment he sat, the world changed. The living room melted away, replaced by a sickening double exposure. He could still see the outlines of his own world, the unpacked boxes, the dusty floorboards, but superimposed over it was another room. A little girl's bedroom from the 1930s. Faded floral wallpaper. A small bed with a white iron frame. The air was thick and cold, and it hummed with the same intense, psychic static of the radio broadcast. And in front of him, a small figure coalesced out of the gloom. She was wearing a white nightgown. Her hair was long and dark. Her back was to him. She was scratching, not at a door, at the wall. Long, slow, deliberate strokes. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The voice was everywhere and nowhere, a panicked, pleading whisper that seemed to come from the very air. "That's not her, Leo. I tried to save her but it made a copy. A thing of noise and memory. It's learning from you. It's making a new story. Get out." The little girl stopped scratching. The scratching sound, however, did not stop. It was now coming from inside the walls of the superimposed bedroom. From inside the walls of his house. She began to turn. It was a slow, jerky movement, like a poorly handled marionette. Leo tried to stand, to run, but he was paralyzed, held fast by an invisible force. He could only watch as she turned to face him. There was no face. Where her features should have been was a swirling, chaotic vortex of black and white static, a screaming mask of raw noise. From within the static, a single, long-nailed, phosphorescent white hand emerged, reaching for him. The scratching in the walls became a frenzied pounding, a desperate thrashing from the other side. The voice, Josiah's voice, shattered into a final, despairing scream that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the static. "It wants a body. It wants to be real." The thing that was once Lydia Holloway took a step toward him. The air grew freezing cold. The hum of the signal rose to a deafening, mind-shattering pitch. The static hand reached for his face. With a surge of primal terror, Leo broke the paralysis. He flung himself out of the rocking chair, scrambling backward across the floor. The superimposed vision of the bedroom flickered and vanished, leaving only his own cold, dark living room. The rocking chair was still. The pounding in the walls stopped. Leo didn't stop to think. He ran. He slammed out the front door, into the overgrown yard, and threw himself into his car. His keys, thank God, were in his pocket. The engine turned over with a roar that was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He sped down the gravel driveway, not looking back, spraying stones behind him. He hit the main road and drove, white-knuckled, toward the distant lights of the interstate, toward the noise and the chaos and the beautiful, blessed, meaningless static of the modern world. He would never stop driving. He would never listen to a radio again. He would sleep with the TV on, with his phone playing music, surrounded by a wall of artificial noise. He would bury the silence under a mountain of sound. He didn't look back. If he had, he would have seen it. In the rearview mirror, the light in the upstairs window of the old Holloway place, glowing with a soft, amber light. And in the dark rectangle of the open front door, a small, pale figure, standing perfectly still, watching him go. 3 days later, Leo was in a cheap motel room outside of Cleveland. He had the television blaring a game show, the faucet in the bathroom dripping into a full sink, and his phone playing a white noise app. The combined din was a fortress against the quiet. He was trying to write. The compulsion hadn't left him. The story demanded to be finished. His fingers trembled over the keyboard of his laptop. The signal doesn't need wires, he typed. It doesn't need a tower. It just needs a listener. It needs a story, and once it's in your head, you carry the transmitter with you. You broadcast it everywhere you go. He saved the document and went to attach it to an email for his agent, a last, desperate attempt to make someone understand. His Wi-Fi signal was weak. He absently reached for the knob on the motel's cheap, plastic clock radio, trying to tune it to find some forgotten AM station, any station, to add to his wall of noise. His fingers brushed the tuning dial. There was a burst of static, and for a split second, cutting through the television's babble and the dripping water and the white noise from his phone, he heard it. Clear as day, a smooth, sonorous, mid-Atlantic accent. And we've just received a wonderful update. Our dear friend has found a new place to rest. The air conditioning unit provides a most agreeable hum, and the neighbors are delightfully loud. It provides excellent cover. The story is progressing beautifully. Soon, it will be time for a new chapter. A new voice. Leo froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice on the radio continued, its tone warm and intimate, a broadcaster sharing a secret with his most valued listener. Don't you agree, Leo? The typewriter arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine that felt unnervingly like dried sinew. It was left on the porch of Elijah's cabin, a place he'd rented specifically for its lack of an address. Deep in the Adirondacks, the only mail he received was delivered by a skeptical UPS driver who navigated the dirt roads like he was traversing a minefield. Elijah didn't order a typewriter. He was a digital ghost, a blogger who wrote under a dozen pseudonyms about conspiracy theories and the occult, his entire life contained within the humming shell of his laptop. This cabin, this self-imposed exile, was his latest attempt to outrun the feeling that he was being watched. The comments on his posts had grown stranger, more specific. They knew things. They used phrases he'd only ever thought. He'd packed up and left his studio apartment in Buffalo in the middle of the night, telling no one. And now this. A package. There was no return address. The shipping label was typed, the letters perfectly aligned, deeply impressed into the paper as if struck with immense force. It was addressed simply to Elijah Vance, the Pine Cone Cabin, Star Hollow. Star Hollow was the name of the valley, a local term not found on any map. He'd only heard it once, from the old man who rented him the cabin. The man's eyes had clouded over when he'd said it. Used to be a town down there. long gone now. Nothing but foundations and stories. We don't go down to Star Hollow. Elijah carried the heavy box inside, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He used a pocketknife to slice the twine. It gave with a sound like a sigh, and peeled back the paper. It was a beautiful, monstrous thing. A Remington noiseless model from the 1930s, all ribbed black steel and Art Deco curves. It was anything but noiseless, even inert. It seemed to promise a heavy, percussive clatter. It smelled of machine oil and something else, something faintly organic, like old parchment and damp earth. Nestled beside it in the box was a ream of pristine, heavy bond paper and a single black ribbon cartridge. He lifted it out, setting it on the rough-hewn pine table he used as a desk. It dominated the space, an obsidian idol from a forgotten age. His laptop, sitting beside it, looked suddenly flimsy and ephemeral. He had no intention of using it. It was a prank, a weird gift from some obsessive reader who'd somehow tracked him down. He left it there, a conversation piece for no one, and tried to focus on his work. But his attention kept drifting back to the typewriter. It had a gravity. The afternoon light glinted off its keys, and the blackness of its body seemed to swallow the light around it. As dusk settled over the pines, painting the cabin in deep blues and purples, a fog rolled in. It was thick and silent, muffling the world until the cabin felt like the last outpost in a formless void. The silence was complete, and in that silence, Elijah heard it. A faint click. He froze, his fingers poised over his laptop keyboard. He listened. Nothing. Just the thick, cottony quiet of the fog. He shook his head, blaming his own paranoia. Click. It came from the table. From the typewriter. He turned slowly. The machine sat there, dark and inert. His heart began to beat a little faster. He stood up and walked over to it. Nothing. He ran a finger over the cold steel of its frame. Clack. The sound was shockingly loud. The shift key had depressed itself, snapping back up with a sharp, mechanical finality. Elijah jerked his hand back. He stared, his breath caught in his throat. The machine was silent again. This wasn't happening. It was a trick of the mind, an auditory hallucination born of isolation and stress. He decided to prove it to himself. He sat down at the table, facing the typewriter. He fed a sheet of the heavy paper into the roller. The paper felt strangely cold. He threaded it, his hands trembling slightly, and wound it into place. He wouldn't type a word. He would just sit here. His logic was flawed, and he knew it. If the machine was haunted, feeding it paper was probably a bad idea. But a deeper, more compelling urge was taking hold. A writer's curiosity. The need to see. He placed his fingers on the home keys. The cool ivory felt like bone. He didn't have to type. The keys began to move. It started slowly. The E key dipped with a soft thump. Then the L, the I, the J, the A, the H. It was typing his name. The carriage shifted with a smooth, oily grind. Elijah. The keys continued, moving faster now, a staccato rhythm that was both mechanical and alive, like the chattering of metallic teeth. You came. We knew you would. You are the perfect vessel. The quiet one. The listener. Elijah tried to pull his hands away, but his fingers were stuck, held fast by an invisible pressure. He could only watch, horrified and mesmerized, as the typewriter wrote to him. We have been waiting. The others were too loud. Their minds were full of noise. Yours is so deliciously quiet. So ready to be filled. Who are you? Elijah whispered, his voice strangled. The keys hammered in response, the letters striking the paper with brutal force, the ribbon imprinting the words in a black so deep it seemed to bleed. We are the story. We are the ink. We were here before the pines. We will be here after. We have been told. We must tell. You will tell us. The carriage ratcheted violently, returning to start a new line. Let us in. A final, thunderous period. And then, silence. The typewriter was still. The pressure on Elijah's fingers vanished. He snatched his hands back, scrambling away from the table, overturning his chair. He stared at the machine, at the words on the page. The message was clear, insane, and utterly undeniable. This was what he had been running from. Not a hacker, not a stalker. It had been waiting for him. It had called him to this hollow, this quiet place, because it knew his mind was a silent room waiting for an echo. He spent the night huddled in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, watching the typewriter. It did nothing. It was just a machine. The fog burned off with the dawn, and the rational world returned. Birds sang. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The terror of the night before felt like a bad dream. He approached the table cautiously. The paper was still there. The words were still there. He tore the sheet from the roller, crumpled it, and threw it into the wood stove. He considered throwing the typewriter in after it, but a superstitious fear held him back. What if burning it didn't destroy it? What if it only released whatever was inside? He decided to ignore it. He spent the day trying to work, writing a bland post about satellite imagery and ancient ruins, his eyes constantly darting to the black monolith on his desk. It was just a thing. An object. It had no power he didn't give it. But as night fell again, the compulsion returned. It was a subtle pull, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. The typewriter wasn't just a machine, it was an invitation. It was the ultimate source. The primary document. Every conspiracy he'd ever written about, every dark occult secret he'd teased from the depths of the internet, it all felt like a dim reflection of the truth that sat on his desk. This was the real thing. Hesitantly, he sat down before it. He fed it a new sheet of paper. He placed his fingers on the keys. This time, he typed, "Who are you?" The keys moved under his fingers, but the words that appeared on the page were not his own. We are the record. The memory of this place. The soil here is steeped in narrative. The first people knew. They told stories of the whispering stones, the shapes in the wood. They gave us form with their words. Elijah's heart was pounding, but it was with a thrilling, terrifying excitement. This was it. The motherlode. What do you want? He typed. We want to be told. A story untold is a pain. An agony. We must be given shape, given voice. The man before you, Josiah, he built his house on the old foundation. He tried to tell us through the airwaves. But the signal was weak. It scattered. It attracted the wrong listeners. The hungry ones in the static. You are better. You are direct. You are a conduit. Josiah, the name from the shipping label. The previous tenant. Elijah's mind raced. He typed another question, his fingers flying now, a collaborator in this bizarre seance. What happened to him? The typewriter's response was swift and grim. He tried to tell the wrong story. He tried to tell a story of hope. Of his daughter's recovery. We showed him the true story. The one of sickness, of cold, of the thing scratching at the door. It broke him. He became part of the narrative. A character in his own tragedy. You are stronger. You see the darkness. You crave it. Tell our story. Tell the story of Star Hollow. Elijah worked through the night. The typewriter didn't move on its own again, it now worked through him. It fed him images, scenes, histories. He learned of the town that had been there a century ago, a logging community that had vanished, not slowly, but all at once. Of the strange cult that had lived on the outskirts, worshipping entities they called, the unwritten. Of the blight that had struck the trees, of the madness that had struck the people, of the whispers that came from the deep wells they had dug. He wasn't typing, he was transcribing. The story poured out of him, a torrent of bleak, cosmic horror. It was the greatest thing he had ever written. It felt true. He forgot to eat, to sleep. He existed only for the next sentence, the next revelation. The cabin filled with the incessant, rhythmic clatter of the keys, a sound that began to feel like the beating heart of the world itself. He started to change. The lack of sleep carved hollows beneath his eyes. His fingers became stained with the ink from the ribbon, a stain that wouldn't wash off, seeping into his skin. He began to prefer the artificial light of the lamp, the circle of illumination that contained only him and the typewriter. The outside world, the sun, the birds, the wind in the pines, felt like an irritating distraction from the real work. The typewriter was his muse, his confessor, his God. It praised him. It told him he was the chosen one, the scribe who would finally give voice to the ancient silence. He started to hear the whispers even when he wasn't typing. They were in the wind, in the creak of the floorboards. They were the same whispers Josiah had heard, the same ones that had driven the loggers of Star Hollow to their doom. But where they had heard madness, Elijah heard inspiration. Days bled into nights. The stack of filled pages grew into a ream, then two. The story was vast, an intricate tapestry of interconnected horrors. He wrote about the thing that lived in the abandoned well, the thing that mimicked the voices of the lost. He wrote about the trees that bled black sap and the shadows that moved with purpose. He wrote it all down, a perfect, terrible record. One evening, as he finished a particularly dark chapter about a funeral that had not gone to plan, the typewriter stopped him. His fingers rested on the keys, but the usual flow of words had ceased. A new sentence formed in his mind, clear and cold, but the keys did not move. It was a command that required his conscious action. The story needs an ending. Elijah blinked, his hand cramping. An ending. The story felt endless. It was the story of the hollow, and the hollow was eternal. All stories must end, the thought insinuated itself into his mind. The best endings are true. They have weight. They have consequence. What kind of ending? He thought, too tired to type. The response was immediate. A vision filled his head. Not of words, but of an image. Himself, walking into the woods at night, carrying a shovel. The moon was high and full, its light bleaching the color from the world. He knew the place. A clearing, near the crumbling foundation of the old church. The earth there would be soft. The story needs a sacrifice, the typewriter whispered in his mind, its voice now as familiar as his own. A true ending requires a true price. The author must become a character. Your final act will be the perfect climax. Your silence, your ultimate gift to the narrative, will be the period at the end of the sentence. Elijah sat back, a cold dread finally piercing the feverish euphoria that had sustained him. This wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a plot point. It was a directive. He looked at his stained hands, at the stacks of paper that contained a world of nightmares. He looked at the typewriter. It sat there, black and patient. It had given him everything. It had made him the greatest writer he could ever be. And now it demanded payment. He thought of Josiah. He had broken. Elijah would not break. He understood. This was the ultimate authenticity. To not just tell the story, but to live it. To die for it. A profound calm settled over him. It was the right ending. The only ending. He stood up. He took the shovel from the porch. He didn't need the typewriter to guide him. He knew the way. The moon was just as he had seen it, a cold coin in a black sky. The woods were silent, holding their breath. He walked to the clearing, to the place of the old church foundation. The earth was indeed soft. He began to dig. The work was hard, physical, real. Each thrust of the shovel into the soil was a word. Each heave of dirt was a sentence. He was writing his finale with his body. He dug deep, until the hole was well over 6 feet, until he stood in a pit of his own making, the smell of rich, loamy earth filling his nostrils. He climbed out. He was exhausted, sweating, and utterly at peace. He lay down on the pile of excavated dirt and looked up at the stars. They were sharp and cold. They were watching. They were readers. He waited. He didn't have to wait long. He heard it first, a rustling in the dead leaves at the edge of the clearing. Then, a soft, shuffling step. Then another. Figures emerged from the treeline. They were not human. They were constructs of shadow and leaf litter, of tangled root and broken branch. They moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, their forms shifting and coalescing in the moonlight. They were the characters from his story. The thing from the well. The blighted trees given motion. The shadows with purpose. They were drawn by the promise of an ending. By the promise of an author's sacrifice. They surrounded the grave. They looked down at him, their faceless heads tilted in a horrible imitation of curiosity. The tallest of them, a thing that seemed woven from the darkness between the pines, raised a limb that ended in a sharpened point of ancient wood. It was time. Elijah closed his eyes. He offered no resistance. This was the story. The pain was immense. A piercing, cold agony as the sharpened point entered his chest. But it was followed not by darkness, but by a sudden, shocking clarity. He felt his consciousness not fading, but transferring. Flowing out of his body and into the narrative, into the soil, into the waiting, hungry things that stood over him. He became the coldness of the earth, the whisper of the wind, the silence of the grave. He became a permanent part of the story of Star Hollow. The figures dissolved, melting back into the woods, their purpose fulfilled. The clearing was empty, save for a freshly filled grave. Back in the cabin, sitting on the pine table, the typewriter was still. A breeze from the open window caught the top sheet of paper in the roller, ruffling it. The keys remained motionless. The story was told. The vessel was empty. It was finished. For now. Weeks later, a hiker, a lone woman seeking solitude on the Appalachian Trail, stumbled upon the cabin. It was clearly abandoned. The door was unlocked. Peering inside, she saw the dusty interior, the empty food tins, and on the table, a beautiful old typewriter next to a towering stack of paper. Curiosity got the better of her. She stepped inside. The place felt still, but not empty. It felt like a library long after closing time. She walked to the table and picked up the first page of the stack. The title, typed in that same brutally deep black ink, read, "The Whispers of Star Hollow." She began to read. The words were hypnotic, terrifying, and utterly compelling. She couldn't stop. She read page after page, her heart hammering, a cold dread seeping into her bones. It was the most brilliant, most frightening thing she had ever read. She reached the end. The final scene. The author, walking into the woods, digging his own grave. The last line read, "The story is never over. It only waits for a new reader. A new teller." The woman shuddered, a mix of horror and exhilaration coursing through her. She looked at the typewriter. It was so beautiful, so inviting. Almost without thinking, she pulled out the chair and sat down. She fed a fresh sheet of paper into the roller. She ran her fingers over the cold ivory keys. She had to know more. She typed a single word, a question mark forming in her mind. "Hello." The keys remained still for a long, long moment. The cabin was silent. Then, with a soft, almost hesitant click, the shift key depressed itself. The typewriter was ready. The story needed a new beginning.